"Are you lost too, mister?" The question landed like a hand grenade with the pin already pulled. Antonio Ramirez's eyes snapped up from the boarding pass he'd been memorizing, Gate 47B, Mexico City, freedom in 43 minutes, and locked onto a pair of impossibly trusting brown eyes that had no business looking at him that way. She stood there in the artificial wilderness of Terminal 3, this tiny creature in a bright red coat that screamed, "Notice me," in a world where Antonio had spent 15 years teaching people to look away. Her yellow backpack hung askew off one shoulder, and perched on her head sat a white knit beanie with little bear ears that flopped when she tilted her head, studying him with the kind of open curiosity that died in most people before kindergarten ended. The terminal breathed around them in its mechanical rhythm. Gate announcements carved through recycled air in monotone urgency, warning passengers about final boarding calls and abandoned luggage. Somewhere behind him, a child's tantrum provided percussion to the rolling symphony of suitcase wheels against polished concrete. Business travelers power-walked past with the single-minded determination of spawning salmon, eyes locked on departure screens like they contained the secrets of the universe. But here, in this pocket of space near the floor-to-ceiling windows where winter light cut through glass in pale geometric patterns, the world seemed to hold its breath and wait. Antonio's thumb had been hovering over his phone screen, the encrypted message to his contact in Guadalajara half composed. "Arriving tonight. Burn the safehouse key after you get this." 7 words that would sever his last connection to American soil. The federal indictment had his name spelled correctly. This time they'd finally done their homework. The arrest warrant would be executed in hours, maybe less. The girl shifted her weight from her left foot to her right, a small fidget that sent a shock of recognition through Antonio's chest. His sister Rosa used to do that exact same thing when she was nervous but trying to be brave. Rosa, who'd been gone for 23 years now, who would have been 31 this spring if Antonio had been better, faster, smarter that night when he was just a kid himself. He forced himself to catalog details the way he'd been trained. Red coat, good quality but not expensive Target, maybe Old Navy. The yellow backpack had a small rip near the bottom zipper, carefully repaired with clear packing tape. Her sneakers were pink with sparkly laces, one tied in a proper bow, the other in a lopsided knot that would come undone in the next 10 minutes. Her jeans showed the faded lines, where previous hems had been let down as she grew. Someone making clothes stretch beyond their intended season. His security instinct activated like muscle memory. 3 exits from this section, 2 to his left toward the food court, 1 behind him leading to gates 40 to 50. His own gate was 200 yards south. He scanned the crowd with peripheral vision, looking for watchers. Airport security? Undercover FBI? Someone had gotten to him before at a train station in Phoenix using a crying baby as distraction while they planted a tracker. "My mommy's in the bathroom," the girl continued, apparently unbothered by Antonio's silence. Her voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting weather conditions. "She told me to stay right by the big window and count to 100 really slow. But I counted to 100 3 times and she didn't come back yet." She swung the yellow backpack around to her front with practiced efficiency, unzipping it while maintaining eye contact. Antonio's eyes flicked to the terminal's security cameras, 4 visible from his position, all pointed at the gate areas, none focused on this window section. Whoever placed him here had thought about sightlines. But something in the girl's absolute lack of performance stopped his paranoid calculus cold. She wasn't performing. Kids who were being used as props, and he'd seen it twice in his career, had a coached quality, a rehearsed spontaneity that didn't match their age. This child moved with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone alone with their thoughts, not someone executing a script. She produced a small pack of crackers from the backpack, the kind with peanut butter in the middle. The wrapper was already torn open, 3 crackers gone, the rest wrapped back up with the care of someone who'd been taught not to waste food. "Are you hungry?" She held the crackers out to him with complete seriousness, as though offering half her rations was simply what people did. "You've been sitting here staring at your phone for a really long time. Mommy says people who stare at phones and forget to eat are usually worried about something." Antonio Ramirez, who had stared down rival cartel lieutenants without blinking, who had negotiated with federal prosecutors and walked away clean, who wore ink on his neck that warned people he wasn't safe. Antonio didn't know what to do with the crackers being offered by a 5-year-old in a beanie with bear ears. His boarding call would sound in 41 minutes. The crackers hung in the air between them. A tiny bridge built by someone too young to know that some people couldn't be saved, shouldn't be approached, weren't safe for little girls with worn-down shoes and carefully rationed snacks. "You can have them," she insisted, pushing the crackers closer. "I already had 3. That's sharing fair." And that's when Antonio noticed it, the thing his instincts had been trying to tell him since she first spoke. The girl's eyes weren't just trusting. They were tracking. She'd looked toward the bathrooms twice while talking. Not the casual glance of a child waiting for a parent, the hypervigilant check of someone who'd learned to monitor threats. He knew that look. He'd taught that look to people he was training to survive dangerous territory. This child wasn't lost. She was hiding. Welcome to the channel. Before we discover why this little girl is really alone, and what Antonio sees that changes everything, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Don't forget to like and subscribe. This story goes places you won't expect. Antonio's training overrode his flight instinct. He stopped seeing an obstacle to his escape and started seeing a tactical situation. His eyes cut to the bathroom entrance. The girl kept glancing toward 30 yards away, partially obscured by a coffee kiosk and a charging station, crowded with travelers hunched over their devices. And there, just visible behind the kiosk's menu board, he saw her. A woman, mid-30s, pressed against the wall with the body language of prey trying to become invisible. She wore a navy blue sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back tight, her eyes locked on the terminal's main corridor with the kind of fixed attention that meant she was watching for something specific. Someone specific. Her right hand gripped her phone like a weapon. Her left arm was wrapped around her midsection in a protective gesture Antonio had seen 100 times before, the unconscious tell of someone guarding a recent injury or remembering where the last blow landed. The woman's eyes flicked to sky for just a second, and Antonio saw raw terror mixed with desperate calculation. She was trying to decide if she should run to her daughter or if moving would expose them both. That's when Antonio saw him, the hunter. He moved through the crowd with the gait of someone who owned every space he entered, his head on a swivel, eyes scanning faces with predatory focus. Mid-40s, athletic build, wearing expensive casual clothes, designer jeans, leather jacket that cost more than most people's car payments. His jaw was set with the particular anger of someone who'd been defied and was about to correct that mistake. The man's eyes swept past Antonio, past Sky, categorizing and dismissing them as he continued his search pattern toward the bathroom area. Antonio watched the man's reflection in the terminal windows, using the glass as a tactical mirror. The hunter moved like someone with training, military or law enforcement. Antonio's instincts whispered. Dangerous. Confident. Used to winning. The boarding call for Flight 447 to Mexico City echoed through the terminal. This is the first boarding call for passengers in Zones 1 through 4. Antonio looked down at his boarding pass. Zone 2. He could stand up right now, walk to Gate 47B, disappear into Mexico where the indictment couldn't touch him, where he could run his operations from the relative safety of Guadalajara's underworld protection. He looked at Sky, still holding out the crackers with patient generosity. He looked at her mother, pressed against that wall, trapped. He looked at the hunter, closing in, 40 minutes to freedom, or 0 minutes to becoming someone else's problem. Antonio Ramirez crushed his boarding pass in his tattooed fist and made a decision that would cost him everything he'd spent 15 years building. Sweetheart, he said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone about to go to war. I need you to very slowly, without pointing, tell me which person you're hiding from. Can you do that? Sky's eyes widened slightly, not with fear, but with the recognition that someone finally understood. The man in the brown jacket, she whispered. He's Mommy's bad mistake. She said we were going to Grandma's house where bad mistakes can't find us. Antonio's eyes found the hunter again in the window's reflection. The man had stopped, his attention caught by something near the coffee kiosk. He'd seen movement. He was turning. The 40-minute countdown to freedom stopped mattering. Antonio had been a destroyer, a weapon, a monster who wore expensive suits to funerals of people he'd killed. But Rosa had believed he could be something else, had seen something in him that wasn't just damage and darkness. Maybe it was time to find out if she'd been right. Antonio stood up, and when he did, he wasn't running anymore. He was hunting. Antonio's world had always operated on threat assessment. 15 years in the cartels had rewired his nervous system into a continuous scanning mechanism that never fully powered down, not even in sleep. He could catalog 20 faces in 3 seconds. Identify exit routes in unfamiliar buildings before he'd taken 5 steps inside. Read body language with the accuracy of a polygraph machine. It was the skill set that had kept him breathing when better men had ended up in shallow graves outside Tijuana. But sitting in Terminal 3 with a 5-year-old offering him crackers, that scanning mechanism had been focused in the wrong direction. He'd been watching for federal agents, for undercover cops with their telltale radio bulges and practiced casual postures. He'd been calculating his own survival, measuring his own escape vectors. protecting his own skin. He hadn't been watching for her danger. The shift happened in the space between heartbeats. Sky still held the crackers toward him, but her small body had angled fractionally to the left, toward the bathrooms, and her free hand had moved to grip the strap of her yellow backpack with white-knuckled tension that didn't match her patient expression. Kids her age didn't have that kind of physical contradiction unless they'd been taught to hide fear. Unless showing fear made things worse. Antonio took the crackers, not because he wanted them, but because refusing them would break whatever fragile trust had brought this child to him in the first place. He held them carefully, like they mattered, because to her they clearly did. "Your mom's in the bathroom," he said quietly, making it a statement rather than a question, watching Sky's micro-expressions the way he'd watch a rival's face across a negotiating table. "How long has she been in there?" Sky's eyes did that tracking thing again, flicking to the bathroom entrance and back so quickly most people would have missed it. "She's not in the bathroom," she whispered, and the admission came out like a confession, like she was betraying a secret she'd been told to keep. "That's what I'm supposed to say if anyone asks. But you seem nice, and Mommy says nice people who share food are usually safe. So maybe it's okay to tell you the truth?" The question mark at the end gutted him. This child was 5 years old and already running probability calculations on who was safe to trust, already deploying cover stories, already carrying the weight of adult secrets on shoulders barely wide enough for backpack straps. Antonio kept his voice level, kept his body language open and non-threatening even as every tactical instinct started firing warning signals through his nervous system. "You can tell me the truth, Sky. I promise I'm listening." Her name had been on her backpack tag, hanging from the zipper pull where concerned teachers could identify lost children. Sky Trevor, purple letters, on a yellow background, decorated with hand-drawn stars. "Mommy's hiding from the bad man," Sky said simply, as though this was a normal fact of her life, unremarkable as weather. "She said we were going to be safe today, that we'd get on an airplane and go far away where bad men can't follow. But then she saw him, and now she's scared again, and I don't know how to make her not scared." The words came out in a rush, spilling over each other with the desperate confession of someone who'd been holding too much inside for too long. "She told me to come sit by this window because bad men don't look at windows. They look at people in lines and people sitting by gates. She said if the bad man comes close, I should pretend I'm with the nearest grown-up so he won't know I'm alone. She said she'll come get me when it's safe, but what if it's never safe? What if—" "Sky." Antonio's voice cut through her spiral with the command tone he used on subordinates when situations were deteriorating. Not harsh, but absolute. "Look at me." She did, those brown eyes swimming now with tears she was fighting to hold back. "Where's your mom right now?" Point without making it obvious. Sky's eyes darted left, toward the coffee kiosk. "Behind the big menu sign, the one with the muffins on it. She's wearing blue." Antonio didn't turn his head. He'd learned years ago how to map spaces using peripheral vision and reflective surfaces. The terminal windows in front of him showed the entire corridor behind him in ghostly overlay, like the world's most expensive security mirror. He shifted slightly, adjusting his angle, and there she was. Navy blue sweater, dark jeans, brown hair pulled back severe enough to hurt. She'd positioned herself with her back to the wall, body compressed into the smallest possible profile, one hand clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her eyes weren't scanning randomly the way nervous travelers looked around. She was hunting specific movement patterns, watching specific zones, calculating specific threat vectors. She'd been trained in this, or she'd learned it through brutal repetition. Either way, she knew what she was doing, which meant the threat was real enough, dangerous enough, consistent enough to require this level of operational awareness. "And the bad man?" Antonio asked, his own body language still relaxed, still casual, not giving away that he'd switched mental gears from fugitive to operative. "Where is he?" "I don't know," Sky admitted. "But Mommy saw him by the big board that shows all the airplane times. That's why she hid. That's why she sent me away. The departure board. Central terminal, maximum visibility, perfect vantage point for someone conducting a search pattern. Smart. Professional. Which meant the bad man wasn't some amateur ex-boyfriend with anger issues. He was hunting with methodology." Antonio's thumb had stopped hovering over his encrypted message. The boarding pass was still crushed in his left hand. Gate 47B was still 200 yards away. Mexico was still waiting. Freedom was still technically possible. But somewhere in the last 90 seconds, the math had changed. Antonio leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping to the frequency that carried to Sky but wouldn't travel beyond their small space. "I need you to trust me on something. Can you do that? Sky nodded, her small hand still gripping that backpack strap. I'm going to take care of this, he said, and heard the commitment lock into place as he spoke it. Your mom, you, the bad man, I'm going to fix it, but I need you to sit right here, exactly like we've been sitting, and wait for me. Don't move. Don't call out. Don't do anything that draws attention. Understand? Are you going to hurt him? Sky asked, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite hope. Maybe it was the exhausted curiosity of someone who'd seen promises broken before. Antonio looked at this child in her red coat and her bare ear beanie, at the crackers she'd shared from her carefully rationed supplies, at the yellow backpack with its hand-drawn stars, and he made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with who Rosa had believed he could become. No, he said, and it was the truth. I'm going to make sure he never scares your mom again. He stood up, and as he did, Antonio Ramirez stopped being the man running from his past and became the weapon he'd spent 15 years sharpening. But this time, the blade was pointed in a different direction. This time, the monster was hunting monsters. Antonio moved through the terminal with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years learning how to be simultaneously visible and invisible. Not so fast that he'd draw security attention, not so slow that he'd lose tactical advantage. He kept his phone in his hand, his eyes down just enough to suggest he was another businessman navigating toward his gate. But his peripheral vision was working overtime, cataloging every body in a 30-foot radius, every reflective surface, every camera angle. The burgundy suit that usually marked him as someone to avoid now worked as camouflage. Business travelers wore expensive clothes. They moved with purpose. They belonged in airports. Nobody questioned a well-dressed man walking with confidence, even if that man had the kind of ink crawling up his neck that suggested he'd made questionable life choices. He tracked toward the coffee kiosk using an indirect approach, angling through the seating area like he was heading for the bathroom corridor. 20 feet out, he had a clear line of sight to where Sky's mother had positioned herself, and the visual confirmation hit him like a gut punch. She wasn't trembling near a vending machine. She was trembling behind one, wedged into the narrow space between the Coca-Cola machine and the wall, her body compressed into an impossibly small profile for an adult woman. Her blue sweater had ridden up slightly on one side, and Antonio caught a flash of mottled purple and yellow across her ribs, bruising that was 2, maybe 3 days old, based on the color progression. The kind of bruising that came from sustained impact, not a single strike. Her phone was clutched in both hands now, screen dark, and her breathing had the shallow, rapid rhythm of someone in active panic, fighting to keep it quiet. She'd positioned herself with a clear view of the main terminal corridor but had sacrificed her exit routes to do it. Classic amateur mistake, eyes on threat. Back to the wall, but no way out if the threat closed distance. She was trapped in her own hiding spot. Antonio kept moving, let his trajectory carry him past her position. Just another traveler in expensive clothes with somewhere important to be, but his tactical brain had already mapped her position, calculated her sightlines, identified her vulnerabilities. She'd picked a defensive position that would work against random searchers but would collapse instantly against anyone with actual training, and the man hunting her definitely had training. Antonio spotted him 30 seconds later, and the recognition was instant and visceral. Predator. The man moved through the crowd with the gait of someone who expected obstacles to clear themselves from his path, and they did. Travelers instinctively gave him space, that subconscious survival mechanism that made prey animals scatter when the lion walked through. He wore dark jeans and a brown leather jacket that probably cost $3 grand, clothes chosen to project success and control. His hair was military short, his jaw set with the particular tension of someone who'd been denied something they believed they owned. Vince. Had to be Vince. The way he moved, the way he scanned, the coiled violence in his shoulders. This wasn't some abusive boyfriend throwing tantrums in trailer parks. This was someone who'd learned to hunt human beings professionally and had decided to apply those skills to his personal life. Antonio watched Vince's search pattern and recognized the methodology immediately. Not random, systematic. He was moving in an expanding spiral from the departure board, checking high-probability hiding spots, first bathroom entrances, seating areas near family restrooms, quiet corners where a panicked woman might try to disappear. His eyes never stopped moving, never locked on a single point too long. Professional surveillance technique executed with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Military contractor, Antonio's instincts whispered. Maybe private security. Someone who'd taken government training and brought it home with him, weaponized it, turned it against someone who should have been safe in his presence. Vince's trajectory was bringing him toward the vending machine area, and he was 70 feet out, closing. His scan hadn't reached the Coca-Cola machine yet, but it would. In 30 seconds, maybe less, his eyes would sweep across that narrow gap and lock onto the woman in the blue sweater. And this whole situation would escalate from tense to explosive. Antonio could see the mathematics of it unfolding with crystal clarity. Vince would move fast once he spotted her. He'd close distance before she could react, before security could respond, before anyone could intervene. He'd put hands on her in the middle of the terminal, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, he'd have her controlled, would be moving her toward an exit, would be using that command voice and that professional bearing to convince anyone watching that this was just a domestic situation. Just a couple having a disagreement. Nothing to see here. Move along. Antonio had seen it executed before, had executed it himself when extracting targets from public spaces. It worked because people didn't want to believe violence could happen in airports, didn't want to get involved, didn't want to become witnesses or heroes or collateral damage. Vince was 60 feet away now, his search pattern tightening. His eyes swept across a family with 3 screaming toddlers, dismissed them, moved on. Swept across an elderly couple struggling with luggage, dismissed them, kept moving. He was eliminating negative spaces, closing in on the positive ones, and Antonio could track his thought process like reading a manual. High probability zones first, defensive positions, places where frightened prey would hide when they stopped thinking tactically and started thinking emotionally. The vending machines were exactly that kind of space. 50 feet. Antonio made his decision and moved. Not toward Vince, not yet, but toward a position that would give him multiple options. He posted up near a charging station with clear sightlines to both Vince and the woman, pulled out his phone, and started scrolling through nothing with the bored attention of someone killing time before a flight. But his weight was balanced on the balls of his feet. His jacket was unbuttoned. His hands were loose and ready. 40 feet. The woman, Sky's mother, whose name he still didn't know, had spotted Vince now. Antonio could see the recognition lock into her body language, the way her spine went rigid, the way her breathing stopped entirely for 3 full seconds before starting again in gasping, shallow pulls. She was calculating the same mathematics Antonio had already solved, seeing the same inevitable conclusion rushing toward her. And she had 0 options. Running would expose her. Staying would expose her. She was frozen in the trap she'd built for herself. 30 feet. Vince's eyes swept across the vending machine area, and Antonio saw the exact moment when training and instinct converged. Vince's head stopped its search pattern scan. His body language shifted from seeking to locking. He'd seen something, a flash of blue, maybe, or the edge of a brown boot visible past the machine's corner. His trajectory adjusted, angling directly toward the Coca-Cola machine now, no longer searching but acquiring. 20 feet. Antonio pushed off from the charging station and began closing distance himself, using the crowd as cover, timing his movement to keep bodies between himself and Vince's peripheral vision. He wasn't running, wasn't drawing attention. Just another businessman heading toward the bathroom corridor. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth noticing. But every step was calculated, every angle measured, every possible outcome mapped. 15 feet separated Vince from his target. 10 feet separated Antonio from Vince. The math was about to change. The hunter was about to discover he'd been hunting in someone else's territory, and the apex predator had finally noticed. Antonio's boarding pass for Mexico was still crushed in his pocket, and gate 47B was getting further away with every step. But Rosa's voice was in his head, clear as the day she'd died. "You're not the monster they made you. You're the one who protects people who can't protect themselves." Time to find out if she'd been right. The announcement cut through the terminal's ambient noise with the cheerful efficiency of a guillotine blade. "This is the final boarding call for Flight 447 to Mexico City, departing from Gate 47B. All remaining passengers should proceed to the gate immediately. This is the final boarding call." Antonio's hand went to his pocket instinctively, fingers finding the crumpled boarding pass, and for 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, the entire world compressed down to a single binary choice. Gate 47B was 200 yards south. His carry-on bag was already stowed in the overhead compartment he'd pre-boarded during the first call, claiming his seat, establishing his presence, then slipped back out, claiming he needed to use the bathroom one more time. Standard protocol for someone who never wanted to be trapped without exit options. The seat was waiting. 17C. Window seat. Left side of the aircraft. Clear view of the tarmac. Secondary emergency exit 3 rows back. He'd memorized the Boeing 737-800's layout before booking. Knew the flight time. 2 hours 43 minutes. Knew the arrival protocol. Private car waiting at Benito Juarez International. Knew the safe house coordinates. 3 backup locations mapped and memorized. He'd spent 6 months setting up this escape route. Called in favors that couldn't be replaced. Burned through cash reserves that represented years of careful operational planning. The federal indictment had 23 counts ranging from racketeering to conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence was circumstantial but comprehensive, built over 4 years of surveillance and testimony from protected witnesses who'd been promised new lives in exchange for old secrets. His lawyer had been crystal clear during their last meeting, delivered in a private room at a restaurant Antonio owned, swept for bugs twice before the conversation started. They're coming for you this week, maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight. The arrest warrant has been signed. Once they pick you up, you're looking at life without parole, best case scenario. More likely you'll be dead before trial. Your enemies list includes people in 3 different federal detention facilities who'd love to earn protection by taking you out. Flight 447 was the difference between freedom and a cage, between continuation and conclusion, between the life he'd built in the blood and ash of 15 years in the cartels and a 6x8 cell in a supermax facility where the sun became a memory and human contact became a weapon used against you. 10 feet away, Vince had reached the vending machine area. His body language had shifted from search mode to acquisition mode, that subtle change in posture that separated looking from finding. He'd spotted something, locked onto it, and was moving with the casual confidence of someone who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. Antonio could see the woman behind the Coca-Cola machine, pressed so hard against the wall that she'd probably have tile-pattern bruises across her back tomorrow. If she got it tomorrow. Her eyes were locked on Vince's approach with the frozen paralysis of a rabbit watching the hawk's shadow circle closer. She'd stopped breathing again, stopped moving, some primal part of her brain convinced that absolute stillness might somehow make her invisible. It wouldn't. Vince was 7 feet from the machine now, and Antonio could read his intentions in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his approach, the way his right hand had dropped casually to his side in a position that would allow him to grab and control in a single smooth motion. He'd done this before. Multiple times. This was practiced, refined, efficient. The boarding announcement repeated, more insistent now. That artificial urgency that airlines use to herd passengers like cattle toward departure gates. Final call for Flight 447 to Mexico City. The aircraft doors are preparing to close. Antonio's phone buzzed in his pocket. His contact in Guadalajara, wondering where he was, why the encrypted confirmation message hadn't been sent. The safe house was ready. The new identity documents were prepared. The extraction team was positioned. Everything was in place except Antonio himself. He thought about the federal agents who'd built the case against him. Good cops, mostly. People trying to do their jobs, trying to take dangerous men off the streets, trying to make the world incrementally safer for people like Skye and her mother. They weren't wrong about what he'd done. The indictment listed crimes he'd actually committed, lives he'd actually taken, communities he'd actually damaged in service of profits and power, and the cold mathematics of cartel economics. He thought about the prison cell waiting for him if he stayed, the enemies who'd line up for the privilege of killing him, the decades that would blur into meaningless repetition, every day identical to the last, time becoming a punishment rather than a progression, his life reduced to appeals and legal briefs and slowly dying hope. He thought about Rosa, 23 years gone, who'd looked at her older brother with absolute faith that he was more than the neighborhood said he was, more than their father had been, more than the streets demanded. She died believing Antonio would be something better, would choose something better, would find a way out of the darkness that consumed their family. He'd spent 23 years proving her wrong. Vince was 5 feet from the vending machine. The woman had closed her eyes, bracing for impact, for hands that would hurt, for a voice that would hiss threats and promises in her ear while dragging her toward an exit where nobody would intervene because domestic situations were messy and uncomfortable and people looked away. Always looked away. Antonio pulled the boarding pass from his pocket, smoothed it out against his thigh. Zone 2, Seat 17C, Mexico City, freedom, survival. The gate agent's voice came through one final time. Flight 447's doors are now closing. Any remaining passengers will need to be rebooked on tomorrow's departure. Tomorrow there would be federal agents at his door. Tomorrow the arrest warrant would be executed. Tomorrow his face would be on the news. Another monster captured. Another victory for the system. Another example of justice eventually catching up. Tomorrow his life as Antonio Ramirez would effectively end. He looked across the terminal toward the windows where Skye sat waiting, her yellow backpack bright against the gray airport seats. her red coat a spot of defiant color in a world of muted business travelers. She was watching him. Had been watching him since he'd stood up. Those brown eyes were tracking his every movement with the hypervigilance of a child who'd learned that adults made promises they didn't keep, that help didn't arrive, that safety was something other people experienced. She'd shared her crackers with him, had offered half her carefully rationed supplies to a stranger, because her mother had taught her that sharing food meant safety, meant kindness, meant the world still had good people in it despite everything she'd seen that suggested otherwise. Vince was 3 feet from the machine. The boarding pass felt impossibly light in Antonio's tattooed hand. Just paper. Just ink. Just a document that represented the difference between freedom and consequence, between survival and sacrifice, between who he'd been and who he might still choose to become. Rose's voice again. Memory or conscience or ghost, he'd never been sure which. You're not the monster, Antonio. You're just scared of being anything else. He looked at the boarding pass one final time. Memorized the confirmation number like he memorized everything important. Then Antonio Ramirez, wanted by the federal government on 23 counts, with 15 years of blood on his hands and a lifetime of violence in his history, crushed the boarding pass in his fist and let it fall. The paper hit the floor with no sound at all. Vince reached the vending machine, and Antonio stopped running. Vince's hand was already in motion, reaching around the edge of the Coca-Cola machine with the casual entitlement of someone retrieving property he'd misplaced, when his tactical awareness finally registered the threat closing from his 6 o'clock. But by then, it was 3 seconds too late, and in close quarters confrontation, 3 seconds was the difference between controlling a situation and becoming controlled by it. The burgundy sleeve materialized in Vince's peripheral vision half a heartbeat before the impact, cutting across his line of approach with the precision of a blade intercepting a strike. Antonio's forearm connected with Vince's extended wrist with enough force to redirect the grab without breaking bone, a calibrated response that communicated capability without escalating to spectacle. The kind of intervention that looked accidental to cameras, incidental to witnesses, but felt absolutely intentional to the person on the receiving end. Vince's body responded before his conscious mind processed what was happening. Muscle memory from whatever training he'd received kicking in automatically. He pivoted on his back foot, pulled his compromised arm back into a defensive position, created distance, and his eyes finally locked onto the source of the interruption. What he saw made his pupils contract fractionally, that involuntary response to recognizing a threat level that exceeded expectations. Antonio stood between Vince and the vending machine at an angle that blocked access while maintaining the appearance of a businessman who'd simply been walking past and accidentally collided with another traveler. His burgundy suit jacket hung open, revealing the white dress shirt beneath, tailored precisely enough that it didn't hide the athletic build underneath. His hands were loose at his sides, not raised, not aggressive, but positioned with the kind of casual readiness that suggested they could become aggressive in the time it took to blink. But it was the ink that told the real story. The tattoos that crawled up Antonio's neck from beneath his collar, dark lines and shapes that carried meaning in the language of violence, territorial markers from organizations that didn't advertise on billboards because everyone who needed to know already knew. The kind of ink you earned through blood and loyalty and surviving situations where most people got buried. The kind of ink that made smart people extremely polite and stupid people extremely dead. Vince's eyes tracked from the tattoos to Antonio's face, and whatever he saw there made his tactical calculation shift instantaneously from aggressive to evaluative. Antonio's expression hadn't changed. He wasn't scowling or posturing or projecting threat the way amateurs did when they wanted to intimidate. His face was completely neutral, almost bored, the look of someone who'd been in so many violent confrontations that they'd stopped registering as events worth emotional investment. That neutrality was more terrifying than rage would have been. "My fault," Antonio said, his voice carrying the smooth baritone of someone used to being heard without raising volume. He gestured vaguely at the vending machine, the universal language of accidental collision. "Wasn't watching where I was going." The words were apology, the tone was warning. The subtext was crystal clear. "I know exactly what you were reaching for, and it's not happening." Vince held Antonio's gaze for 3 seconds that stretched into tactical eternity, some primal part of his hindbrain running threat assessment algorithms that had kept him alive through whatever wars or operations or dark hallways he'd survived. Antonio could see the calculation happening behind Vince's eyes, weighing options, measuring commitment, trying to determine if this was a witness who'd back down under pressure or a problem that required a different approach. "No worries," Vince said finally, forcing casualness into his voice. But his body language betrayed him. His weight had shifted back onto his heels, creating additional distance. His hands had moved from aggressive positioning to neutral territory. His shoulders had dropped half an inch from their coiled tension. Every micro-adjustment communicated the same message. Reassessing threat, choosing discretion, backing down without admitting he was backing down. But his eyes flicked past Antonio toward the vending machine, still hunting, still locked on his objective, and Antonio saw the moment when Vince decided this was a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent obstacle. He'd wait. He'd circle back. He'd find another approach vector. Men like Vince always did. They didn't give up. They adapted. "You looking for someone?" Antonio asked, the question carrying manufactured curiosity. Just another bored traveler making small talk in the dead space of terminal waiting. But he'd positioned himself differently now, shifted his weight so that he wasn't just blocking access to the vending machine but controlling the approach angle entirely. Vince would have to physically move Antonio or abandon his position, and neither option would look accidental to the security cameras covering this section. "Just trying to find the bathroom," Vince said. The lie smooth and practiced, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he'd lied to authority figures enough times to perfect the delivery. "These terminals all look the same after a while. Bathrooms are that way," Antonio said, gesturing toward the corridor behind him, the opposite direction from where Vince had been moving. "Can't miss them. Big signs with the stick figures." The corner of Vince's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, more like a predator showing teeth. "Appreciate it," but he didn't move. Neither did Antonio. They stood there in the artificial lighting of Terminal 3, two men who'd both learned violence professionally, both calculating the same mathematics from different angles. Behind Antonio, invisible to Vince but present in every choice he made, Sky's mother remained frozen against the wall, barely breathing. Somewhere across the terminal, Sky sat by the windows with her yellow backpack, waiting to see if the man who'd taken her crackers would keep his promise. The PA system crackled to life again, announcing a delayed departure, something about mechanical issues, the routine disruptions of airport operations, continuing their indifferent rhythm around this moment, that would determine whether a woman and child made it onto their flight, or became another statistic in a police report nobody would read. Carefully enough. "You traveling alone?" Vince asked. And there it was, the probe, the test, trying to determine if Antonio was an isolated obstacle or part of a larger complication. "Business trip," Antonio replied, matching Vince's conversational tone while his peripheral vision tracked every micro-movement. "You?" "Heading home," Vince said. And the possessive weight he put on the word home made it clear he was talking about people, not places. "Had some family business to take care of. You know how it is. Sometimes people need reminding about where they belong." The threat wasn't even veiled. It was gift-wrapped and delivered with a smile, the kind of statement designed to intimidate without providing anything actionable to witnesses. Antonio had used similar language himself 100 times, threatening rivals in restaurants and bars where plausible deniability mattered more than actual denial. He recognized the tactic because he'd mastered it years before Vince learned to tie his boots. "Family's important," Antonio agreed, and let his own smile surface, the one that didn't reach his eyes, the one that had preceded broken bones and last words in back alleys from Tijuana to Chicago. "That's why we protect them. Make sure nobody forgets that family means you don't get to treat people like property. You feel me?" The smile vanished from Vince's face like someone had cut power to a light switch. His jaw set, that particular tension returning to his shoulders, and for half a second Antonio saw the real man underneath the controlled facade. Saw the rage, saw the entitlement, saw the cold calculation that had probably been there since childhood, since whatever moment had taught him that violence was how you maintained control and fear was how you maintained relationships. "I think we understand each other," Vince said quietly, and his hand moved fractionally toward his jacket pocket. Not reaching, just indicating, suggesting the possibility of escalation without committing to it. Antonio's hands didn't move at all, didn't need to. His eyes locked onto Vince's with the flat assessment of someone who'd been threatened by experts and found the experience boring. "I think we do," Antonio said. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk away, find your gate, get on your flight, go home alone, and you're going to forget you ever came looking for anyone in this terminal. Because if I see you near that vending machine again, we're going to have a very different conversation in a very different location." The words hung in the air between them, not loud enough to draw attention, but weighted with the absolute certainty of someone who'd followed through on similar promises enough times that making them had become reflex. Vince stared at Antonio for 5 full seconds. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his gait still confident, still controlled, but his trajectory now angled toward the terminal exit rather than the vending machines. Antonio didn't watch him leave. He pulled out his phone, appearing to check messages, while his peripheral vision tracked Vince's retreat and his tactical awareness monitored every person in a 30-foot radius for signs that Vince had backup, had partners, had resources that would complicate the situation beyond a simple confrontation. But Vince kept walking, disappearing into the crowd of travelers, another expensive jacket in a sea of expensive jackets. And Antonio finally let himself breathe again. Behind the vending machine, Sky's mother was crying silently, her whole body shaking with the release of terror held too long under pressure. Antonio turned toward her, and when he did, the lethal expression melted into something gentler, something that might have been compassion if compassion could coexist with tattoos that marked you as a killer. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think you and your daughter have a flight to catch." Antonio didn't let Vince get 15 feet before his tactical instincts started screaming warnings that 15 years in the cartels had taught him never to ignore. Men like Vince didn't retreat. They regrouped, they circled back, they adapted their approach, and came at problems from different angles, more dangerous for having learned where the first resistance appeared. Walking away wasn't surrender for men like that. It was reconnaissance. Vince would wait 20 minutes, maybe 30. Let Antonio think the threat had passed. Let his guard drop fractionally. Then he'd come back with a different strategy, probably involving airport security and a convincing story about a custody dispute, restraining orders that may or may not exist, official-sounding language that would turn institutional authority into his weapon. Or he'd simply wait near the gates, watching for the woman and child, knowing they had to funnel through TSA eventually, knowing they had nowhere to go but forward into his ambush. Either way, intercepting him once wasn't solving the problem. It was postponing it. Antonio's decision calcified in the space between heartbeats. He moved through the crowd with predatory efficiency, closing the distance Vince had created, his expensive shoes silent against the terminal tile. Vince was angling toward the central corridor, probably heading for a position where he could surveil the security checkpoint, and his body language broadcast confidence that the immediate threat had passed, that he'd successfully disengaged from an unpredictable variable. That confidence made him sloppy. Antonio caught up to him near a cluster of charging stations where business travelers hunched over laptops like digital-age gargoyles, too absorbed in their screens to notice two men having a conversation. His hand landed on Vince's shoulder with the casual familiarity of an old friend spotting someone in a crowd, and before Vince could react, before his training could activate defensive protocols, Antonio had pulled him close in what would look to any witness like an enthusiastic greeting. "We're not done," Antonio said directly into Vince's ear, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone delivering information rather than threats. His other hand gripped Vince's elbow, controlling his center of gravity, making it physically difficult to pull away without creating a scene. "You're going to stand here and listen, and you're going to understand something about how the world works now." Vince's body went rigid, every muscle tensing for fight or flight, but Antonio's positioning had eliminated both options. They were locked together in an embrace that looked friendly from 10 feet away but felt like a cage up close. Vince's hand moved toward his jacket pocket again, faster this time, committed rather than suggestive. And Antonio's knee came up fractionally, just enough pressure against Vince's thigh to communicate that escalation would be mutual and immediate and very, very public. "Don't," Antonio said simply, and Vince's hand froze. "We're having a conversation. That's all this is. Two guys talking. Nobody needs to get hurt here unless you make choices that require hurt. I don't know who you think you are," Vince started, his voice tight with controlled rage, trying to reclaim authority through tone, since physical dominance had been neutralized. "But you're interfering in a family situation you don't understand. That woman is she's not yours," Antonio interrupted, his voice dropping even lower, intimate enough that someone 5 feet away wouldn't hear the words, but would register the intensity. "She stopped being yours the second she decided to run. And that little girl? She was never yours. Children aren't property. Women aren't property. And men who think they are? They learn very painful lessons about being wrong." Vince tried to pull back again, putting strength into it this time. But Antonio had 40 pounds on him and 15 years of experience controlling hostile bodies in confined spaces. The grip on his elbow tightened fractionally, pressure points engaged with clinical precision, and Vince went still with the involuntary compliance of someone whose nervous system had been overridden by pain that hadn't quite materialized yet, but was clearly waiting in reserve. "You're making a mistake," Vince said, but his voice had changed, lost some of its confident edge. I have resources, connections. I can make your life very complicated. My life is already complicated, Antonio replied. I'm wanted by the federal government on 23 counts. I just missed my flight to Mexico to deal with you. Complicated stopped scaring me about a decade ago. You want to try me with connections and resources? Brother, I ran cocaine through 6 states and never spent a night in jail. I have bodies buried in 3 countries and friends in places you don't even know exist. Your worst day is my fucking Tuesday. The words settled between them with the weight of absolute truth, and Antonio felt Vince's body language shift from resistant to receptive, from fighting the reality to beginning to accept it. Fear was a language Antonio spoke fluently. He knew exactly how much to apply, exactly where the pressure points lived between intimidation and panic, between compliance and desperation. Here's what's going to happen, Antonio continued, his tone shifting from confrontational to instructional, like a teacher explaining material the student needed to pass. You're going to walk out of this terminal. You're going to get in whatever car brought you here. You're going to drive back to whatever city you came from. And you're never going to look for that woman or that child again. You're going to forget they exist. Forget their names. Forget what they look like. They're ghosts now. Dead to you. Gone. And if I don't? Vince asked. The question coming out strained, like someone who already knew the answer but needed to hear it confirmed. Antonio pulled him closer, their faces inches apart, and let Vince see what lived behind his eyes. The accumulated weight of 15 years destroying lives for money and power. The absolute absence of hesitation or mercy that came from crossing moral lines so many times that the lines themselves had stopped existing. He let Vince see the monster that civilized clothes and expensive suits and airport terminals couldn't quite contain. I know people who hurt men like you professionally, Antonio said, each word deliberate and measured. People who make you disappear so completely that your own mother would walk past your bones and not recognize them. I know warehouses where screaming doesn't carry. I know stretches of desert where nobody asks questions about fresh dirt. And I owe favors to men who would consider this kind of work a gift, a pleasure, a fucking vacation from their normal operations. He paused, let that sink in. Felt Vince's breathing go shallow with the recognition that this wasn't posturing, wasn't exaggeration, wasn't tough guy performance. This was someone explaining logistics. But you know what's worse than all that? Antonio continued. Worse than being disappeared? Being marked. I can make one phone call and your name goes on a list that circulates through every organization that matters in this city. Every restaurant you walk into, every bar, every gym, every place where real men handle business, they'll know what you are. They'll know you hunt women and children. And men who prey on the weak? Brother, we save special treatment for men like that. Because even killers have standards. Vince's face had gone pale. That particular gray-white color that came from blood redirecting away from the skin toward vital organs. The body's involuntary preparation for trauma. His eyes had lost their predatory focus, replaced with the hunted awareness of someone who'd just realized the food chain had layers they hadn't accounted for. I understand, Vince said quietly, and the words came out defeated, diminished. The confident operator from 5 minutes ago replaced by someone who just learned they weren't the apex predator they'd believed themselves to be. No, Antonio corrected. You don't understand yet. But you will. Every time you think about coming back, every time you think about looking for them, you'll remember this conversation. You'll remember my face. And you'll remember that I gave you a choice today. Walk away and live your life, or make me a priority in mine. And trust me, you don't want to be a priority in my life. He released Vince's elbow but maintained the shoulder grip for one more second, a final emphasis, then stepped back and smoothed his burgundy jacket like they'd just finished a pleasant conversation about flight delays and weather. His expression returned to neutral, bored businessman again. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth remembering. Vince stood there for 3 seconds, his body still processing the conversation, still running calculations on whether resistance was viable or survival required compliance. Antonio could see the moment when self-preservation won out over ego. Vince's shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched, his hands moved to his sides, palms visible, universal language of surrender. We're done here, Vince said, trying to reclaim some dignity in the retreat. Yeah, Antonio agreed. We are. Vince walked away. And this time his gait was different, faster, less controlled, the confident swagger replaced with the purposeful stride of someone leaving a situation they wanted distance from. Antonio watched him navigate through the terminal toward the exit signs, tracked him until he disappeared past the security checkpoint heading outbound, until the threat was neutralized through fear, if not permanently, then at least for today. At least long enough for a woman and child to get on a plane and disappear into whatever new life they were trying to build. Only when Vince was completely gone did Antonio allow himself to feel the weight of what he'd just done. Not the confrontation that was reflex, muscle memory, nothing remarkable. But the cost, missing the flight, staying in the country, accepting that tomorrow the federal agents would come, that the life he'd built was over, that the escape he'd spent 6 months planning had been sacrificed for 2 strangers and a 5-year-old girl in a red coat who'd offered him crackers. His phone buzzed. His contact in Guadalajara. 3rd message now. Getting worried. Getting impatient. Antonio deleted the message without responding. Behind him, near the vending machines, Sky's mother still waited, still trembling, still not believing she was safe because women who'd been hunted long enough stopped believing in safety entirely. Antonio walked back toward her, and when he did, he wasn't a cartel enforcer or a federal fugitive or a man marked by violence. He was just someone trying to keep a promise to a little girl who'd seen something in him that maybe, possibly, might actually be there. The woman had slid down the wall behind the vending machine until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her body together through sheer force of will. Mascara tracked down her cheeks in dark streaks that told the story of how long she'd been crying, how long she'd been holding terror inside until it leaked out anyway. Her blue sweater had ridden up enough that Antonio could see the full extent of the bruising, now ribs, hip bone, the distinctive pattern of someone who'd been grabbed and thrown, grabbed and held, grabbed and hurt repeatedly over days or weeks or months. She looked up when Antonio's shadow fell across her, and the expression that crossed her face was pure animal fear, the kind that came from a nervous system that had been trained through repetition, that men approaching meant pain. She tried to make herself smaller, pressed harder against the wall, her breathing going rapid and shallow like she was preparing for impact. Antonio stopped 10 feet away, didn't close the distance, didn't loom, didn't crowd her space. He crouched down instead, lowering his center of gravity, making himself less threatening through body language that cost him tactical advantage but bought him her trust. His hands stayed visible, palms open, the universal signal of non-aggression. "He's gone," Antonio said quietly, his voice stripped of the edge he'd used on Vince, gentle down to something that might reach through trauma without triggering more of it. "Vince. He left the terminal. He's not coming back." The woman's eyes searched his face with desperate intensity, looking for confirmation, looking for lies, looking for whatever tells would indicate whether this was real safety or just another trap. "You don't know him," she whispered, her voice raw from crying, from fear, from whatever screaming she'd done in the privacy of places where screaming didn't bring help. "He always comes back. He always finds me. I ran before, 3 times, and he always—" "Not this time," Antonio interrupted, keeping his tone certain. "Absolute. I made sure he understood what happens if he comes looking. Trust me when I tell you, men like him understand the language I speak. He's done." She wanted to believe him. Antonio could see it in the way her body language shifted fractionally toward hope, before defaulting back to skepticism, the way someone who'd been disappointed too many times protected themselves from future disappointment by refusing to accept good news. "Who are you?" she asked, and the question carried layers beyond simple curiosity. Who was he that he could make someone like Vince walk away? Who was he that he'd intervened at all? Who was he that a 5-year-old had trusted enough to grab his hand? "Someone who's done bad things for bad reasons," Antonio said, offering honesty instead of comfort. "But today I'm trying to do a good thing for a good reason. Your daughter is sitting by the windows waiting for you. She's scared but safe. And you have a flight to catch, assuming you still want to leave." The woman's hand went to her pocket, pulled out a crushed boarding pass that matched the one Antonio had dropped minutes earlier. "Flight 624 to Orlando," she said. "Leaves in 45 minutes. My mother lives there. She doesn't know we're coming. I was going to call her from the airport, but then I saw him, and I just—" Her voice trailed off into the space where coherent thought had collapsed into panic. Antonio pulled out his phone, and the woman flinched at the movement, that involuntary response to men reaching for things quickly. He slowed deliberately, showing her the device, letting her see it wasn't a weapon, wasn't a threat, was just a phone. "What's your name?" he asked. "Claire," she said after a hesitation that suggested she was calculating whether giving him that information created vulnerability. "Claire Trevor. Claire. I need you to listen carefully, Antonio said, his thumb already moving across the screen, pulling up contacts, finding the number he needed. You can get on that commercial flight to Orlando if you want. But commercial flights have passenger manifests. They have security footage. They have electronic trails that people with resources can follow. Men like Vince, if they're connected, if they know who to pay, they can find those trails. Claire's face went pale again, hope draining out as quickly as it had appeared. So what do I do? Where do I go? I can't stay here. Heal. I have a plane, Antonio said simply, and watched confusion replace fear on her face. Private charter. Small jet, seats 8, currently on standby at a hangar 20 minutes from here. I keep it available for emergencies. This qualifies as an emergency. I can't afford a private plane, Claire said. And there was something almost funny about the practicality of the objection in the context of everything else happening. I barely scraped together enough for 2 commercial tickets. I don't have— You're not buying it, Antonio interrupted. I'm giving it to you. 1 phone call, and that plane goes wherever you need it to go. Orlando, if that's still the destination. Somewhere else if your mother's place isn't safe. Mexico if you need to disappear completely. Europe if you want an ocean between you and your past. Claire stared at him like he was speaking a language she didn't understand. Her brain clearly struggling to process why a stranger would offer something this valuable, this impossible, this generous. Why would you do that? She asked. You don't know me. You don't know Sky. Why would you risk? She stopped, looked at his tattoos, at the expensive suit, at the way he carried himself with casual authority in a space most people navigated with anxiety. What do you want from us? The question hung between them, loaded with all the times men had offered Claire help that came with conditions, came with prices, came with expectations that turned assistance into another kind of trap. Antonio recognized the suspicion because he'd operated in that world long enough to know how transactional everything became when you dealt with dangerous people. Nothing, he said, and meant it. I want absolutely nothing from you except for you and Sky to get somewhere safe. That's it. That's the entire transaction. People don't just give away private planes, Claire said, still searching for the angle. The cost. The inevitable moment when the bill would come due. People like me do, Antonio replied. People who've spent 15 years taking things from the world and are looking for one opportunity to give something back. Consider this my donation to the cause of women and children getting away from men who hurt them. No strings. No conditions. No debts. He held up his phone, showing her the contact he'd pulled up. Marco, his head of security, the man who'd been watching this entire encounter from strategic positions throughout the terminal, who'd seen Antonio miss his flight, who'd watched the confrontation with Vince, who was probably extremely confused about why his boss was sitting on an airport floor talking to a terrified woman instead of being wheels up to Mexico. 1 phone call, Antonio said. Marco arranges the plane. You and Sky get driven to the private hangar. No TSA lines, no passenger manifests, no electronic trail that anyone can follow. The pilot files a flight plan to Orlando. You land at a private airfield, and a car takes you to your mother's house. You disappear completely. Claire's breathing had started to stabilize, the rapid panic rhythm slowing towards something more measured. And then what? What happens to you? Antonio smiled, and it was the saddest expression he'd worn all day. Then I deal with the consequences of missing my flight, but that's my problem, not yours. Your only job is to take your daughter and build a life where men like Vince become distant memories instead of daily nightmares. I don't understand, Claire said, but her hand had moved to her phone, clutching it like a lifeline. Why would you sacrifice your escape for us? Because a 5-year-old girl grabbed my hand and asked if I was lost too, Antonio said simply. And I realized I've been lost for a very long time. Maybe helping you find your way is how I start finding mine. He stood up slowly, giving Claire space to process, space to decide, space to believe that maybe, possibly, this was real help without hidden costs. He pressed the call button on his phone and brought it to his ear, and when Marco answered with cautious confusion in his voice, Antonio delivered instructions with the same authority he'd used to move millions in product and coordinate operations across 3 countries. The private charter, Antonio said. I need it repositioned for an emergency extraction. 2 passengers, woman and child. Destination Orlando, private airfield. No manifest, no questions, no paper trail. How fast can you make that happen? Marco's response came through with the efficient compliance of someone who'd stopped questioning his boss's decisions years ago. 40 minutes to get them to the hangar. Plane can be wheels up in 20 after that. Total time, Call it 90 minutes. Make it 60, Antonio said. And Marco? This one's personal. I need you to escort them yourself. Make sure they get on that plane. Make sure nobody follows. Make sure they disappear. Understood, Marco said. Boss, you want to tell me what's happening with Mexico? Mexico's not happening, Antonio replied. New plan. I'll brief you later. He ended the call and looked down at Claire, who was staring at him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and desperate hope. Car's on the way, he said. 60 minutes and you're gone. But we need to move now. Get Sky, stay with Marco, and don't look back. Claire struggled to her feet, her legs shaky from adrenaline crash and sustained fear. And when she was standing, when she was face to face with Antonio, she did something unexpected. She reached out and took his tattooed hand in both of hers, holding it with the same trust her daughter had shown an hour earlier. Thank you, she said. And the words came out broken, inadequate for the magnitude of what was being given. I don't know how to... You don't need to, Antonio said gently. Just go be a good mother. That's all the thanks I need. Marco arrived 18 minutes later, moving through the terminal with the efficient purpose of someone who'd extracted high-value targets from hostile territory enough times that airports felt like easy mode. He was compact and dangerous in the way that former special operations soldiers were dangerous, all controlled movement and tactical awareness wrapped in a forgettable gray suit. His eyes found Antonio immediately, then tracked to Claire and Sky, running the same threat assessment Antonio had performed earlier, cataloging vulnerabilities and calculating solutions. Boss, Marco said. His voice neutral but his eyes asking questions his mouth wouldn't voice in front of civilians. Questions like why Antonio was still in the country, why the Mexico extraction had been aborted, why they were burning resources on strangers when the federal indictment was probably being executed as they stood here talking. Get them to the hangar, Antonio said, pulling Marco aside for 30 seconds of private instruction. Priority 1. Nobody follows. Nobody asks questions. You personally verify they get on that plane and you personally verify it takes off clean. Understood? Understood, Marco said. And you? I'll handle my situation, Antonio replied. Which wasn't an answer but was all the answer Marco was going to get. Sky had been reunited with her mother 5 minutes earlier, and the reunion had been everything Antonio had hoped it would be, and nothing he'd prepared himself to witness. The way Claire had dropped to her knees and wrapped her daughter in her arms. The way Sky had buried her face in her mother's shoulder and finally let herself cry. The way they'd held each other like they were each other's gravity, in a world that kept trying to spin them apart. It had hit Antonio somewhere in his chest that he'd thought had been calcified beyond feeling. Now Sky stood holding her mother's hand, her yellow backpack secured on her shoulders, her red coat zipped up against the terminal's aggressive air conditioning, and she was looking at Antonio with those brown eyes that had started this entire cascade of decisions. She pulled her hand free from her mother's grip and walked over to him with the serious purpose of someone delivering an important message. You kept your promise, Sky said. And the simple declaration carried more weight than any thank you could have managed. Mommy says you're sending us on a special airplane. She says we're going to be safe now because of you. Antonio crouched down to her level, the same way he'd crouched for Claire, making himself small for someone small. That's right, he said. You and your mom are going to go somewhere far away where bad men can't find you. And you're going to be happy and safe, okay? Will you be safe? Sky asked, and the question landed with unexpected precision, like she'd intuited something the adults were trying not to acknowledge. The bad man was scary, but you were scarier. Scary people don't usually help. They usually hurt. But you helped. So maybe you're not scary. Maybe you're just sad. Out of the mouths of children, Antonio thought, came the kind of truth that adults spent years learning to avoid. Maybe I'm both, he admitted. But helping you made me less sad. So thank you for that. Sky reached into her backpack and pulled out the pack of crackers, the same ones she'd offered him earlier, now even more depleted. She held them out again with the same earnest generosity. For your trip, she said, wherever you're going, so you don't forget to eat. Antonio took the crackers, felt the weight of them in his palm, this offering from a child who had so little and gave so freely. I won't forget, he promised, and slipped them into his jacket pocket, next to the crushed boarding pass that represented a life he'd chosen not to live. Marco cleared his throat, the subtle signal that timing was getting tight, that staying in one location too long created vulnerability, that extraction windows closed quickly when you were operating outside legal frameworks. Claire picked up Sky, settled her on her hip with practiced efficiency, and gave Antonio one last look that communicated everything words couldn't properly express. Then Marco was moving them toward the exit, toward the private car waiting outside, toward the hangar and the plane and the future that Antonio had purchased for them with his own freedom. Antonio watched them disappear into the crowd of travelers, watched until Sky's red coat was just another splash of color in the terminal's visual chaos, watched until they were gone, and he was alone again in a space that suddenly felt much emptier than it had an hour ago. That's when he heard the radio chatter. Security personnel were converging on the terminal, more than the usual patrol patterns, moving with purpose toward specific coordinates. Antonio's tactical awareness, that constant background process that never fully shut down, identified the pattern immediately. Someone had reported the confrontation with Vince. Or airport security had flagged something suspicious about a well-dressed man having an intense conversation with another man near the charging stations. Or facial recognition software had finally matched Antonio's face to the federal database of wanted individuals, and the system had just caught up with his location. Whatever the trigger, the result was the same. The net was closing. Antonio could run. The terminal had multiple exits, multiple corridors, places where someone with his training could disappear into crowds and emerge somewhere else with a different gait and different body language and enough operational security to get outside the immediate perimeter. He could call in favors, activate backup plans, burn through the remains of his network to create distance and confusion. He could probably stay free for another week, maybe 2 if he was smart and lucky and willing to hurt people who got in his way. But Sky's crackers were in his pocket. Claire's gratitude was still fresh in his memory. And Rosa's voice was in his head, clearer than it had been in years, asking him the question she'd asked the night she died. When are you going to stop running, Antonio? When are you going to stand still long enough to become someone you can live with? He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows where he'd first met Sky, the same windows that looked out onto the tarmac where planes taxied and departed, and carried people toward destinations that represented hope or escape or second chances. He pulled out his phone, opened the tracking app Marco had installed on all the vehicles, and watched the small blue dot that represented Claire and Sky's car, moving steadily toward the private hangar. Behind him, the security presence was intensifying. 3 officers now, then 5, then 8, coordinating through radios and hand signals, establishing a perimeter that was contracting steadily inward with Antonio at the center. They hadn't spotted him yet, hadn't identified him specifically. Were still in the searching phase rather than the apprehending phase. He had maybe 3 minutes before that changed. On his phone, the blue dot reached the hangar, stopped. Time passed in increments that felt like hours compressed into seconds. Then the dot started moving again. Not toward the terminal, but away, tracking the path a small jet would take from private hangar to runway, the trajectory of departure and freedom and futures that started fresh. Antonio switched apps, pulled up the flight tracking software he used to monitor cartel shipments, entered the tail number of his private charter, and watched the plane appear on the grid. Still on the ground, still stationary. Then, as he watched, the icon moved, gained speed, accelerated down the runway that led to altitude and distance, and everything Claire and Sky needed to disappear completely. The plane lifted off. Antonio watched it climb, watched it bank east toward Orlando, watched it become just another blip on a screen full of blips representing all the people going all the places they needed to go. He watched until it crossed into the next sector, until it was far enough away that even if someone wanted to recall it, even if Vince had resources that could reach that far, the window had closed and the opportunity had passed. Sky was safe. Claire was safe. And Antonio Ramirez, wanted on 23 federal counts, with 15 years of blood on his hands and a lifetime of violence in his history, smiled. Not the predatory smile he'd used on Vince. Not the sad smile he'd given Claire. This was something different. Something he barely recognized because he'd felt it so rarely that his face didn't quite remember how to form the expression properly. Peace. The security officers spotted him 30 seconds later. There was a moment of confusion as they cross-referenced what they were seeing with what they were looking for, running facial recognition protocols, confirming identities, verifying that the well-dressed man standing calmly by the windows was indeed the federal fugitive whose arrest warrant had been activated 3 hours ago. Antonio didn't run, didn't reach for anything, didn't make any movement that could be interpreted as threatening or hostile. He just stood there, hands visible, body language open, waiting for them to close the distance and do what they'd come to do. Antonio Ramirez, the lead officer called out, his hand on his weapon but not drawing it, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone who expected compliance but was prepared for resistance. "That's me," Antonio confirmed, and heard his own voice carry a strange quality of relief, like he'd been holding his breath for 15 years and was finally being given permission to exhale. The officers swarmed him with professional efficiency, hands directing him to his knees, cuffs securing his wrists behind his back, Miranda rights being recited in that practiced monotone that turned constitutional protections into background noise. Antonio cooperated with every instruction, made himself easy to process, easy to control, easy to transport, as they lifted him to his feet and began walking him toward whatever vehicle would transport him to whatever facility would hold him until federal marshals arrived. Antonio looked out the window one more time. The plane carrying Sky and Claire was gone now, disappeared into the vast sky that connected everywhere to everywhere else. And somewhere up there, a 5-year-old girl was safe enough to fall asleep, secure enough to dream, protected enough to imagine a future where bad men were just stories instead of daily reality. Antonio had destroyed a lot of things in his life, had taken a lot more than he'd given, had carved his name into the world through violence and fear and the systematic dismantling of anything that stood between him and profit. But today he'd built something instead. Today he'd used all those terrible skills and dangerous resources and hard-won connections to protect instead of destroy, to save instead of take, to be the kind of man Rosa had believed he could become if he just chose differently. The federal agents were rough with him. Not abusive, but not gentle either. The way you handled someone whose file contained allegations of murder and conspiracy and organized crime spanning multiple jurisdictions. They pushed him into the vehicle with practiced efficiency, secured him in the back seat, and began the process of transporting him toward a future that involved trials and plea negotiations and probably decades in federal custody. And as the vehicle pulled away from the terminal, as Antonio watched the airport recede in the side mirror, he reached into his jacket pocket with cuffed hands and felt the crumpled package of crackers Sky had given him. He was smiling when they took his mugshot. The federal prosecutor had been a woman named Catherine Chen, mid-40s with steel-gray streaks in her black hair and eyes that had seen enough plea negotiations to recognize when someone was actually remorseful versus when they were just performing remorse for reduced sentencing. She'd sat across from Antonio in a conference room at the Metropolitan Detention Center, his case file stacked 18 inches high on the table between them, and she'd delivered the government's position with clinical precision. 23 counts, she'd said, tapping the file with one finger. We have testimony from 14 witnesses, surveillance footage spanning 4 years, financial records that document money laundering operations totaling $47 million. We have you cold on at least 8 of these counts, probable conviction on another 6, and enough circumstantial evidence on the remainder that a jury would likely vote to convict on at least half. You're looking at life without parole, Mr. Ramirez. Multiple life sentences, actually, running consecutively. Antonio had sat in his orange jumpsuit and listened without interrupting, because Catherine Chen wasn't telling him anything his own lawyer hadn't already explained in smaller words, with more desperate encouragement to cooperate, to flip on higher-ups, to buy his way into reduced sentencing through betrayal and testimony. However, Chen had continued, and that single word had carried the weight of possibility, the suggestion that the mathematics of justice weren't quite as fixed as they appeared. The Bureau is interested in certain aspects of your organization's operations, specifically trafficking routes, distribution networks, and higher-level contacts in Mexico and Colombia. You provide substantive cooperation, and I mean substantive, Mr. Ramirez, not the usual criminal defendant nonsense of giving us information we already have, and we can discuss alternatives to life imprisonment. The negotiation had taken 4 months. Antonio's lawyer had fought for minimum security from the start, had argued that his client was a flight risk who'd chosen not to flee, had surrendered peacefully, had shown remorse through actions rather than words, had sacrificed his own freedom to protect a woman and child from domestic violence, which demonstrated capacity for rehabilitation that the court should acknowledge. Catherine Chen had been skeptical of the redemption narrative but pragmatic about results. She'd wanted names, dates, routes, account numbers, the operational architecture of a cartel network that had moved product through 6 states for over a decade. And Antonio, sitting in detention with nothing left to protect except maybe his own soul, had given her everything. Not the names that would get people killed. He'd drawn that line firmly and his lawyer had respected it. But the routes, the methods, the financial structures, the logistical frameworks, all of it went into federal evidence storage, and in exchange, Antonio Ramirez pled guilty to 6 counts of conspiracy and money laundering, received a sentence of 5 years in minimum security federal facility, eligible for early release after 3 with good behavior. He'd served 2 years and 4 months. The morning of his release, Antonio stood in the property room of FCI Morgantown, and received back the personal effects that had been cataloged and stored when he'd first arrived. One burgundy suit, professionally cleaned by the facility, one pair of Italian leather shoes, one wallet containing $200 in cash and no credit cards, because those accounts had been frozen and seized, one cell phone, obsolete now, its charge long dead, and one crumpled package of crackers in a sealed evidence bag, marked personal item, sentimental value. The property officer had raised an eyebrow at the crackers but hadn't commented. You saw strange things working in federal corrections. Men who treasured photographs of children they'd never see again, letters from family members who'd stopped visiting years ago. Small objects that represented entire lives compressed into whatever could fit in a manila envelope. Antonio had signed for everything, changed out of his prison khakis, into the burgundy suit that still fit but hung differently on a body that had lost 15 pounds of muscle and gained something harder to quantify, and walked toward the release gate with the contained efficiency of someone who'd learned to move through institutional spaces without drawing attention. The gate officer handed him a standard release packet information about parole requirements, contact numbers for his assigned officer, documentation of his release conditions including travel restrictions and mandatory check-ins. And beneath the official paperwork, forwarded through the facility's mail system and held until release day per his own request, was an envelope. No return address. Italian postage, postmarked Florence. The handwriting was careful and feminine, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone had taken time to make sure their words were legible, that this message would reach its intended destination, despite crossing an ocean and penetrating a federal facility's security protocols. Antonio stood just outside the gate, the morning sun hitting his face for the first time, without bars or fencing fragmenting the light, and opened the envelope with hands that had steadied considerably during 2 years of forced reflection and voluntary change. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten on cream-colored stationery, and a photograph. The photograph showed Skye, older now, 7 or maybe 8, standing in front of what looked like the Duomo in Florence, her arms spread wide like she was trying to hug the entire cathedral. She wore a yellow dress that matched her old backpack, and her smile was uncomplicated, genuine, the expression of a child who'd been safe long enough that fear had faded into memory rather than remaining as constant companion. Behind her, slightly out of focus, stood Claire, one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, looking at the camera with an expression that communicated everything about how far they'd traveled, how much distance they'd put between their past and their present. Antonio studied the photograph for a long moment, memorizing details, cataloging the visual evidence of promises kept and sacrifices justified. Then he unfolded the letter and began to read. Dear Antonio, I don't know if this will reach you, or if you'll even want to hear from us after everything that happened. But Skye insisted we write, and when Skye insists on something, I've learned to listen. She's good at knowing what's right. We made it to Orlando that night. My mother cried when we arrived. Not sad tears, relieved tears. She'd been trying to get me to leave for 2 years. But I kept making excuses, kept believing Vince would change, kept thinking I could manage the situation. I was wrong about that. You were right. Men like him don't change until someone makes them change. We stayed in Florida for 6 months, long enough for me to file for full custody, get a restraining order, start divorce proceedings, long enough for Skye to start 2nd grade at a school where nobody knew our history, long enough for me to start believing we might actually be safe. Then my mother suggested we go further. She had a friend who'd retired to Florence, who said there was work teaching English to Italian students, that Americans with teaching credentials could find opportunities in the expat community. So we went. We've been here 18 months now. Skye is learning Italian faster than I am. She has friends who've never seen her flinch when someone raises their voice. She sleeps through the night without nightmares. I got your name from the news reports about your arrest. I've been following your case, watching the proceedings, trying to understand what happened to you after you gave us everything. I know you took a plea deal. I know you're in federal custody. I know that saving us cost you your freedom, and I don't know how to carry that knowledge except to try to build a life that's worthy of the sacrifice. Skye talks about you sometimes. She calls you the kind man with the sad eyes who gave us the magic airplane. She doesn't remember Vince's face anymore, but she remembers yours. She says when she grows up, she wants to help people the way you helped us, wants to be brave enough to do the right thing even when it's hard. I don't know what to say except thank you. And I'm sorry. And I hope wherever you are, whatever you're facing, you know that you changed 2 lives completely. You gave us a future we wouldn't have had without you. And maybe that doesn't balance whatever scales you're trying to balance in your own life. But it matters. You matter. What you did matters. If they ever let you out, if you ever find yourself in Italy, we'd love to see you. There's a small cafe near our apartment where Sky and I have breakfast on Saturdays. She always orders the chocolate croissant and saves half in case someone needs sharing. I think you'd understand why that makes me cry every time. With gratitude we can never fully express. Claire and Sky Trevor. Antonio read the letter twice, standing there on the sidewalk outside FCI Morgantown, while other released inmates collected their belongings and disappeared into waiting cars or onto public buses that would carry them toward whatever life they'd try to rebuild. He read it a third time, and his hands shook slightly on the final pass, not from fear or anger or any of the emotions that had dominated his life before the airport, but from something simpler and more complicated. Relief, recognition, redemption, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. His parole officer was expecting him in 48 hours. He had travel restrictions that limited him to West Virginia and the surrounding states. He had mandatory check-ins scheduled monthly for the next 3 years. He had conditions of release that included prohibited association with known criminals, mandatory employment, random drug testing, and immediate reporting of any address changes. He had a future that looked absolutely nothing like the future he'd been building for 15 years. But he also had a photograph of a 7-year-old girl smiling in front of a cathedral in Florence, alive and happy and safe, because of a choice he'd made in an airport terminal, when every practical instinct had screamed that he should choose differently. He had a letter from a woman who'd stopped looking over her shoulder, who'd crossed an ocean to build a life where fear became optional rather than mandatory. He had evidence that sometimes destroying your own life created space for other people to build theirs. Antonio Ramirez, former cartel enforcer, federal convict, man marked by violence and bad choices, and 15 years of being the monster in other people's nightmares, carefully folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket next to the package of crackers he'd carried through 2 years of incarceration. He looked at the photograph one more time, then put it in his wallet, where it would live next to his parole documentation and his release papers and all the official evidence of who he was trying to become. Then he walked away from the prison gates, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Antonio wasn't running from something. He was walking toward it. Whatever it was, whoever he might still become, the future was uncertain, but it was his, and he'd earned it through sacrifice and choice, and a 5-year-old girl who'd seen something in him that he'd spent 2 years learning to see in himself. He was finally, truly free.